Good afternoon and good morning to some of you. Welcome to today's event on the margins of the 49th session of the UN Human Rights Council. My name is Jacqueline Streitfeld Hall. I'm the Research Director at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, and I will be your moderator. On behalf of the Global Center and all of our co-organizers and co-sponsors, we'd like to thank you all for your participation today in this important discussion on the civilian impact of impunity and the urgent need to ensure accountability in Yemen. For the past 7 years, populations in Yemen have suffered from an unrelenting cycle of atrocities. All parties to the conflict have perpetrated violations and abuses that likely amount to war crimes, causing tens of thousands of civilian casualties. Their lawless conduct has not only caused immense civilian suffering, but has also created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. This has been exacerbated by unmitigated impunity and a widening accountability gap. Despite the horrors of the ongoing conflict, this past October, the Human Rights Council failed to adopt the mandate renewal of the Group of Eminent Experts on Yemen, known as the GEE. This marked the first time a mandate for a human rights monitoring mechanism was voted down at the HRC since its creation in 2006. The GEE was the only international and independent investigative body reporting on violations and abuses in Yemen, and its abrupt termination in October was a major setback for all victims. The GEE's public reporting helped fill the immense accountability gap in Yemen. The work and existence of the group sent a signal to Yemeni civilians that UN member states would not turn a blind eye to their suffering, and that the survivors and victims may one day be able to realize their rights to justice and reparation. Since the termination of the group's mandate, there has been a devastating escalation in violence. High Commissioner Bachelet emphasized this connection in her recent Item 2 oral update. Civilian casualties resulting from hostilities have almost doubled since October as compared to the preceding 4 months. Monthly airstrikes by the Saudi UAE-led coalition have increased by more than 100%, reaching rates not seen since early 2018. The Houthi armed group also continues to violate the laws of war, firing mortars, rockets, and other missiles indiscriminately into heavily populated areas. Meanwhile, the escalation in hostilities has further deteriorated the humanitarian conditions in the country, worsening a human-made catastrophe that already threatens millions of Yemeni lives. In December 2021, over 80 civil society organizations, including the Global Center, launched a joint appeal calling on UN member states to establish a new, robust accountability mechanism for Yemen. Recent developments bring this appeal into sharp focus. They starkly demonstrate the civilian impact of accountability gaps and the consequences of impunity that UN member states must urgently work to prevent. Today, we are joined by a group of expert panelists that will address these pertinent topics in detail. To start off the event, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker and a dear colleague, Ms. Radia Al-Mutawakkil, co-founder and chairperson of Muwatana for Human Rights. Radia, Muwatana is renowned around the world for robust documentation of international law violations and abuses in Yemen. What has your organization documented during the recent violent escalations since the termination of the GE in October, and how have civilians been impacted?
Thank you. In last September, we were trying to have a community-focused investigative mechanism beside the GEE. And then in last October, we lost the GEE and we didn't have a community-focused investigative mechanism. That was a very clear message of impunity to parties to the conflict in Yemen from the international community. And I can say clearly that this message was received by all parties to the conflict. I'm saying this because when I checked the data, our data in Muwatana about the violations since last October until the mid of March, was like much more than the violations that happened 1 year before the last October. For example, we have documented since last October 19 airstrikes, where 109 civilians have been killed and 200 has been injured, 22 ground attacks, 22 incidents of landmines, 39 incidents of life minution. In these incidents, hundreds of civilians have been killed and injured. And also child recruitment, dozens of incidents of child recruitment, and also about 43 incidents of using schools, also attacking hospitals, 7 attacks for hospitals, and about hundreds of incidents of preventing humanitarian access for humanitarian aid, and 96 incidents of arbitrary detention. This is happening all the time by all parties to the conflict in Yemen, but it has increased. It was like less in the 20, we started to feel that violations are still going on, but started to be less. And then since October, started to be much more with numbers. Besides all of this, parties to the conflict, they are still using starvation as a weapon of war. Yemenis are not suffering only because of the very direct violations by all parties to the conflict, but also the daily life is getting more complicated. The economic, now we have a fuel crisis, people are still not paid their salaries, and everything. Whenever we as Yemenis think that we started to get used to the whole crisis and started to try to cope to it, the crisis tells us that I have more. And this is what's happening these days. These days, it's very difficult for people from all levels. The lack of impunity is one reason that all parties to the conflict really don't care about civilians in Yemen. And this is like a one result of not having a champion on states to go to the General Assembly to have a resolution, to have a criminally focused investigative mechanism, and also not to have the courage to had it last October in the Human Rights Council. We will feel very weird to feel that we are in a competition, like the conflict zones are in a competition with each other. All civilians in all conflict zones are the same. They are suffering and they deserve the help and they deserve accountability. But unfortunately, the world is not dealing with all civilians as they are the same. And I don't want to feel that I am in a competition with any other victim or civilian around the world. But Yemenis are ignored and they became more ignored everywhere, every year. And thank you.
Thank you, Radia, for those heartfelt remarks. Our next speaker is Erin Hutchinson, the Yemen Country Director at the Norwegian Refugee Council. Erin, you have been following closely the humanitarian and civilian impact of deadly hostilities in Yemen. What have been the humanitarian consequences of recent escalations and the worsening impunity in Yemen?
First, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this important topic today. As the conflict in Yemen moves into its 8th year, we're seeing escalations in violence across multiple front lines across the country. Unfortunately, it's not the parties to the conflict who suffer the most, it's the innocent civilians who are bearing the brunt of this violence. In February, new figures showed that the number of civilians killed or injured in Yemen has almost doubled since the end of the Group of Eminent Experts mandate ended last October. In the 4 months before and after the end of the GEE mandate, 823 civilians were injured or killed as a result of the conflict. In the 4 months that followed, it was 1,535. This is coming from the data from the Civilian Impact Monitoring Project. The actual numbers could be higher than this. During the same period from October to February, 39 times more civilian casualties were caused by airstrikes. Let me repeat that. 39 times more civilian casualties were caused by airstrikes in the 4 months after the end of the GEE mandate than in the 4 months before. These are not just figures. These are real people. These are mothers, daughters, fathers, sons, people with families who loved them, people who had already been struggling through 7 years of war that they had nothing to do with causing. These numbers make a strong case for what we know to be true in many parts of the world. Impunity leads to horrific abuses that will likely continue until those responsible are held to account. While we can't say that this horrific increase in deaths and injuries are directly linked to or caused by the end of the mandate, we can say that in the 4 months after, more innocent civilians were dying or were injured than in the 4 months before. These numbers are certainly alarming. And what does this increase in civilian casualties mean concretely? It means that families are dying during their sleep because an airstrike fell on their house. It means a child losing a leg because he stepped on a mine on the way to school. Every number is a person whose life is forever changed as a result of this impunity, and we must never lose sight of that. The escalation in violence has also led to thousands more people fleeing their homes, fleeing the very place that should provide safety to them. Just this week, my colleagues spoke with Hamid Ibrahim, a 38-year-old father of 5 who NRC is working with. At the end of February, bombs started falling on his village, and he was forced to flee with his family, along with dozens of other families from his community. Hamid had a job, he had a home, he was able to provide for his family. Today, he has none of that. He's living in a camp for internally displaced people. His family is sleeping outdoors. His children are not going to school, and all of them are hungry. While we are able to provide them with assistance, frankly, this is just a drop in the ocean. If the GE mandate was in place, perhaps whoever had launched those airstrikes would have thought twice about it. Intensified, unchecked fighting not only directly results in displacement and the destruction of livelihoods, making people aid dependent, but also causes them to engage in dangerous coping mechanisms. Our teams are seeing young girls getting married, sometimes as young as 12 years old. 12 years old, because their families simply cannot afford to provide the basic necessities anymore. The escalation in the conflict and lack of accountability leads to further constraints on an already overburdened humanitarian response. It means that in some cases, we simply cannot reach the communities and assist people in need. Unexploded ordinances being laid down result in death and severe, long-lasting, and life-changing disabilities. It's leading to ever-increasing long-term healthcare needs that the health system simply cannot support after being decimated by 7 years of war. It makes it difficult for communities to access the basic services that they so desperately need, and makes it more difficult for humanitarians to reach them. In recent months, we've also witnessed an increase in attacks on civilian infrastructure. We've seen the destruction of schools, of health facilities, telecommunications infrastructure, and even water and sanitation infrastructure. In January, a water reservoir in Saba was hit by an airstrike, effectively cutting off 120,000 people from accessing safe drinking water. That's 120,000 people who, in just one moment, lost access to one of the most basic things they need to survive, clean water. At NRC, we think that the rule of this crucial human rights investigative body took us backwards. Who's responsible for the deaths of these children and families? Will anyone be held accountable for violations of international humanitarian law? There's no longer any independent international impartial monitoring mechanism for civilian deaths here in Yemen. We strongly believe that the UN member states must urgently reinstate an international, independent, and impartial accountability mechanism to ensure that parties to the conflict stop committing grave breaches of international humanitarian law with impunity. Because with no one to hold perpetrators accountable, civilians will continue to be killed by the thousands. Member states should continue to engage in political discussions to advance an inclusive peace process, including ensuring a prominent role for women and youth, as peace is the only solution that will allow the people of Yemen to live in safety and rebuild their lives. Member states must also put human rights at the center of their conversations, both privately and publicly. They must stress with all parties to the conflict the obligation to respect international humanitarian law and protect civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian workers. The existing gap in monitoring IHL violations must be urgently addressed, alongside an accountability mechanism to hold perpetrators to account. Certainly, the people of Yemen need an end to the conflict. In the meantime, the absolute minimum that the international community can do is to monitor and hold parties to the conflict accountable. There are quite a lot of strong words at this week's pledging conference on what needs to be done. Ensuring an independent, impartial, and international monitoring and accountability mechanism is one of the most basic things that the international community can do, and they can do it right now. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you today. We urge the international community to take urgent action to protect the innocent civilians of Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. I believe the evidence and anecdotal story you just provided really help emphasize what Radia so poignantly said that removing the GEE was a message well received by the perpetrators, and the escalation has clearly shown that. So now that we've heard from Erin and Radia about how the situation has escalated since October, I now have the honor to bring in our next panelist, Mr. Ardi Imseis, a member of the Group of Eminent Experts on Yemen before its termination in October. Ardi, the GE famously labeled the Yemen conflict as a pandemic of impunity. Could you share with us the details of the group's characterization of the accountability gap in Yemen? And what recommendations has the GE made for the international community in this context?
Thank you very much, Jackie. I should like to begin by thanking all of you, the organizers of this event, for inviting me to address you as a former member of the GEE. As ever, I must also begin by paying tribute to the proud people of Yemen at a time when many in the international community are rightly horrified by crimes and atrocities taking place elsewhere. We must make collectively every opportunity and take every opportunity to call attention to the fact that Yemen's suffering continues unabated while its people thirst for justice. It doesn't bring me any joy to say this, but say it I must. We told you so. Last September, my colleagues and I in the group of experts told the international community that after 4 years of investigating and reporting to the world on the humanitarian situation and the human rights situation in Yemen, we had arrived at the conclusion that Yemen is a nation abandoned. Abandoned to its relative apathy, to the relative apathy shown by members of the international community towards resolving the conflict. Abandoned to its uniquely cruel fate of seemingly boundless death and destruction, felt particularly by the civilian population, women, children, the elderly, migrants, minorities. Abandoned to the bitter conclusion that, but for where and who they are, and indeed who their tormentors are, calls for accountability would have long ago been met with requisite political will, universal application, and action. Little did we know that our assessment of Yemen's abandonment by the international community last September would serve as a premonition of searing accuracy for our own work. By choosing not to renew the mandate of the group of experts merely days after our final report, the people of Yemen were deprived of the only United Nations independent entity investigating and issuing detailed public reports on human rights violations committed by all parties to the conflict. If ever there was a case of shooting the messenger, I can think of none more clear, and for the people of Yemen more bitter, than the non-renewal of the Group of Eminent Experts last October. As everyone knew would happen, and as has already been set out by my colleagues on this panel, the war has continued apace. And with it, the killings, the torture, the indiscriminate bombardment, the food insecurity, the untold deprivations of basic human rights, and others. All of this has continued with reckless abandon as the people of Yemen struggle to keep their heads above the waterline on the high seas of international indifference. It is with great appreciation, therefore, that I salute the principled people in the NGO sector, including each of my co-panelists and their organizations, for having continued their own vital work aimed at achieving justice and accountability for the people of Yemen. Immediately following the close of the last Human Rights Council, these groups mobilized to press for the establishment by the General Assembly of a new investigative mechanism for Yemen in December, in line with the group of experts' previous recommendations focused on accountability. Because that mechanism was not established, because the war has since picked up steam, and because the people of Yemen remain victims of international crimes and violations of their human rights, I should like to take a few moments, as invited by Jackie, to reiterate the group's recommendations, all of which remain a matter of public record, all of which remain actionable and more relevant than today. First, the United Nations Security Council must immediately refer the situation in Yemen to the International Criminal Court. The ICC was established to ensure that the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole should not go unpunished, particularly where relevant domestic authorities are unable or unwilling to do so, as continues to be the case with Yemen. With every day that passes, evidence of the international crimes being committed in Yemen continues to mount. As I mentioned only months ago, there is no principled reason for the Security Council not to trigger the complementary jurisdiction of the ICC. Forgive me. Second, the Security Council must expand its list of persons and entities subject to sanctions under its Resolution 2140. In principle, this sanctions regime holds great promise. However, so long as only a small number of persons and entities are on the list, and this is the point, from only one party to the conflict, this mechanism cannot reasonably be expected to deliver on that promise. Given that the existing criteria allow for designations of individuals and entities on the basis of their involvement in human rights and humanitarian law violations of the sort that has been well documented, including by the Group of Experts, pressure must be brought to bear on members of the Security Council to expand the list. The politicization of the list must be resisted at all costs. Third, in line with the important efforts of the NGO community that I've already mentioned and which took place last December, there remains the need for the establishment of an independent international investigative mechanism for Yemen with a mandate similar to those established for Syria and Myanmar. The Syria case is a particularly important precedent, for it demonstrates that collective action is possible through the General Assembly if only enough political will can be brought to bear to make it happen. Avoiding the narrow political dynamic impeding movement in the Security Council makes this an obvious path to pursue, notwithstanding recent efforts that have been unsuccessful in this regard. Fourth, third states must investigate war crimes over which they have jurisdiction and, where appropriate, prosecute such crimes. States must also fulfill their duties to prosecute or extradite that arise under international human rights law. The invocation of the domestic jurisdiction of third states as a potential avenue for redress for victims in Yemen is important, not least because it is usually at the domestic level that options for individual criminal accountability are most robust, so long as they are consistent with relevant international legal standards. In this regard, many interested states, including those that continue to supply arms to the parties to the conflict, have domesticated their international obligations to prosecute or extradite perpetrators of war crimes domestically. Efforts should therefore be made to see how these facts can be creatively employed to seek accountability. Fifth, in the longer term, Yemeni authorities and the international community should engage in further dialogue about the creation of a special tribunal, such as one that applies a hybrid of international law and domestic law to prosecute individuals most responsible for war crimes and other violations. Experience with such tribunals has varied in success, but based on their use in other contexts, such as in Cambodia, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste, best practices may be drawn and lessons learned going forward. Dear friends, some may say that these recommendations are unrealistic, that the veil of apathy is too strong to pierce. I say the opposite is true. If anything has been made clear to us in recent weeks, states do have the ability to act on the basis of the principles of law that they often claim fidelity to. The challenge is to figure out ways to compel them to act where they choose not to. In this respect, soft power matters, and civil society must step in to keep the pressure up and, of course, the hope alive. To call attention to the need to apply universal international legal standards universally, without regard to who the perpetrators or the victims are. Results, of course, are neither guaranteed nor immediate. But as we have again seen from recent events, the long road to accountability needn't begin with the hard edge of criminal justice. Non-criminal measures of sanction, including boycott and divestment by non-state actors, such as corporations, cultural and sporting federations, trade unions, universities, and others, can and should be looked to as venues where Yemen's quest for an end to its predicament can begin to take hold. There is little doubt that countervailing forces remain at the ready to frustrate such efforts, but the efforts nonetheless ought to be considered and perhaps pursued, if only to remind the powers that be that the plight of Yemen and its people will not, indeed must not, go unchallenged. Thank you.
Thank you, Artie, for those very powerful remarks and for your hard work on the GE itself, which has proven to be such a vital tool towards accountability in Yemen. Our next panelist is Mr. Jeremy Smith, Director of the Geneva office of the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. Jeremy, based on the very dire situation we've been discussing today, what are the paths forward for the international community?
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who is speaking today and to the participants and to the organizers. I wanted to begin by pointing out that civil society from around the world has repeatedly spoken out on the issue of the disbanding of the GEE since last October. And overwhelmingly, the message is one of unity and one of a true commitment to ensuring that this wrong is righted. And I believe that there are people throughout the world, concerned people, concerned organizations throughout the world that truly want to see this outcome changed. And that is not simply because of what is happening in Yemen, but because of the dire consequences that that decision could have on multiple situations across the world, and what sort of message that that sort of sends in terms of protection of victims throughout the world in multiple situations, including most recently in the Ukraine. And the primary call that civil society has made has been really to reiterate the recommendation of the Group of Eminent Experts, has been to say that the Group of Eminent Experts, after years of painstaking documentation and analyses, made a very clear recommendation to the United Nations in terms of how to move the process of accountability forward and what the United Nations can do. That is, and it's a simple one, on paper at least, and that is create an evidentiary gathering body that will put cases together, that will pursue concrete accountability, that will hold individuals and groups accountable, and move that process forward in concrete ways. And this is really where I think civil society is asking the international community to go now. There are multiple avenues the international community could do this at, whether at the General Assembly in New York, whether at the Human Rights Council. The forum in which it is pursued at is not as important as ensuring that accountability is pursued. And I think that the testimonials of Radia and others today demonstrate the human cost, the tragedy that a lack of political will has resulted in. And I think it's also important to note that this is not simply a matter of making a political choice. This is a matter of making a choice in which millions of lives are at stake here. And when I say millions of lives are at stake, I do not think that's an exaggeration. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen is the largest in the world. Tens of millions face the possibility of dying or starvation from starvation, disease, violence. And this crisis is not the result of an earthquake or a tsunami. It is man-made, it is human-made. It is the direct result of individuals, groups, and governments choosing to target and attack regular people, humanitarian aid, and civilian infrastructure. Ending these violations is the only way to end the humanitarian crisis, the only way to protect millions of lives. And to end these violations, it is clear, requires accountability and real consequences for individuals, groups, and governments who are carrying out such violations. There is no clearer situation in the world in which accountability is directly connected to the well-being and lives of so many. And yet, here we are talking about the need for even an accountability mechanism. I think it's important to recognize that states, when disbanding the GEE, made a very cynical and disturbing choice. Member states of the Council chose to appease or bow to Saudi and Saudi coalition pressure over the needs of millions of people. So the asks of global civil society is very clear. The needs on the ground are very clear. The question will be now, what will states choose to do? States who voted no for the first time last year can change their position. Bangladesh, Indonesia, Senegal, Togo, you can change that position. You can help save people. New members of the Council and existing members who voted no can change that position. States like Bolivia, Burkina Faso, Gabon, India, Mauritania, Philippines, Sudan, Uzbekistan, Venezuela, member states who abstained or did not cast a vote, Armenia, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Japan, Malawi, Namibia, and Ukraine. These states have an opportunity to change their position and to begin to protect millions of lives. And we hope that they will. There is a very critical need for two aspects of a UN investigation. And that is one, as I've said, the gathering of evidentiary profiles and pursuing of accountability. But now there's another gap. One opened last October, and that is the public reporting on what is happening in Yemen and ensuring that the world and UN member states understand what is occurring and the consequences of actions there. So both gaps need to be filled. And we believe that there is the possibility, a very realistic possibility, that states can fill that gap through a single mechanism. And that gap can be filled, and it is doable. And so we urge all of those who are participating in this meeting to ensure that they do whatever they can to create the necessary momentum and to create the necessary response to right the wrongs of last year when the GEE was disbanded. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for so succinctly describing what global civil society has been calling for and for laying out very clearly who can and should make these changes and fill the accountability gap in Yemen. Our final panelist is Mr. John Fisher, Geneva Director at Human Rights Watch. John, what are some of the lessons learned, particularly from an institutional perspective at the HRC, following the termination of the GEE, given the increase in violent hostilities and civilian consequences we have seen since in Yemen?
Thank you, Jackie, and thanks to everybody for your participation today. And I've been following the Human Rights Council since it was created 16 years ago. And I can honestly say that the termination of the mandate of the Group of Eminent Experts was a low point in the Council's history, probably the low point in the Council's history. As you pointed out, never before has a Council resolution been defeated on a vote. For that to happen on a country mandate by a state, at the instigation of a state which is a party to the conflict, for no reason other than to escape scrutiny for documented international crimes, is a travesty. So the loss of the mandate really is a stain on the integrity of the Human Rights Council. It should be a stain on the collective conscience of all those states that Jeremy has identified who failed to support the renewal of the mandate. At the same time, we believe that the loss of the mandate was not inevitable. We understand that Saudi Arabia and its coalition allies began what one journalist has called a stealth campaign some months before the September session of the Human Rights Council at high level in capitals, using a mix of threats and incentives to bully and buy the necessary votes to pressure states to switch from abstentions to no votes, from yes votes to abstentions, targeting new members of the Human Rights Council, as Jeremy has identified. We understand that there was one Muslim majority state who was told that their citizens would have difficulty accessing the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, if they failed to vote against the renewal of the mandate. We understand that another was offered financial incentives and was offered an embassy if they voted against the mandate. And sure enough, those two states moved from an abstention to a no vote on the resolution. I do believe that it was also something that I have to acknowledge Saudi Arabia did very effectively in terms of keeping this pressure campaign under wraps. We didn't see it coming, and I have to acknowledge that as civil society, even though it was a priority for us. We heard that a number of states working to renew the mandate were also taken by surprise until quite late in the context of the Human Rights Council session. I think it probably was partly a casualty also of the pandemic context. It's been a difficult 2 years, I think, where we've operated in a largely virtual realm and not had the opportunity to exchange with colleagues from all regions of the world at the Human Rights Council. Those kind of conversations in the corridors where we can speak with states who might be wavering, understand their concerns, respond to misinformation. If there is misinformation about the nature of the mandate, its importance, what's at stake, part of the role of civil society is to help to address that, as I think our colleagues have demonstrated here today. But of course, when that context is stripped away, not only did we not get early indication of what Saudi Arabia and the coalition were up to, but we weren't able to engage as effectively with some of those states who may have had concerns. Saudi Arabia certainly was engaged in a massive misinformation campaign. We understand that they were projecting misinformation about the nature of the mandate, the methodology, the conclusions of the Group of Eminent Experts. But in fact, the truth is they began their campaign to terminate the mandate long before the Group of Experts even released their report. So their argument that there were, which they raised towards the end, that there were concerns with the findings in the report clearly were, was a concocted argument. At the same time, as I say, it was not an inevitable outcome. That was a very close vote, 21 votes to 18. There has been, I think, if we had been aware sooner of the efforts to terminate the mandate, there would have been the opportunity to counter some of that misinformation. I believe that there would have been the opportunity for states who were working in support of the mandate to also be reaching out at a high level in capitals and to try and ensure that the traditional support for the mandate was maintained. In terms of the consequences of the termination, I think that's been laid out very clearly by my colleagues. It is really a devastating loss to see that that following termination of the mandate, civilian casualties have almost doubled, both as a result of coalition airstrikes and as a result of Houthi abuses. And that simply underlines the importance of an independent international mechanism that is able to monitor the conduct of all parties to the conflict. And so, I mean, I think where we're left now is that there is a heavy responsibility on states to now ensure both the reinstatement of a monitoring, reporting, and accountability mechanism, and ideally, as Jeremy has pointed out, also the strengthening of that mechanism. There are some discussions in terms of what kind of mechanism would now be appropriate. Even before, of course, the termination of the mandate, the Group of Eminent Experts was recommending the creation of a IIIM type mechanism, as Adi has underlined, a mechanism like that exists for Syria and for Myanmar, to not only monitor and report, but also to build case files for eventual prosecution, to identify perpetrators, to gather that evidence in a way that it can be used to a justiciable standard. And it's quite clear from what we have seen in recent months that in the absence of that sense or that prospect of international accountability, the parties to the conflict feel emboldened to act with almost complete impunity. So now the international community is faced with a very stark and very necessary choice, which is both to reinstate a reporting and monitoring mechanism, but also to ensure that there are strengthened paths towards accountability, and particularly to take up the proposal of the Group of Eminent Experts and put in place something with a really robust accountability pillar to its work along the lines of the IIIM. There have been discussions, as Jeremy has pointed out, as to whether that should take place at the General Assembly in New York, or whether it takes place at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Both are viable paths. I mean, we saw, of course, that with the Syria IIIM type mechanism, it was the General Assembly that stepped up to create that mechanism, particularly when it felt that the path to accountability through the Security Council was blocked by the use of the veto. So just as the failure of the Security Council to deliver on accountability prompted the General Assembly to act on Syria, so too the failure of the Human Rights Council to do its job and maintain a robust monitoring and accountability mechanism on Yemen should and could also prompt the General Assembly to act. One advantage of that forum, of course, is that because it has universal membership, there are many states that didn't have their arms twisted by Saudi Arabia and its coalition allies to take position against the mechanism. We saw a joint statement there by the Netherlands at Third Committee towards the end of last year in support of renewing or re-establishing a mechanism. Yemen, prompted by Saudi Arabia, had a counter statement, but with fewer votes in support. But the large majority of the General Assembly just hasn't yet taken a position. So if you like, the forum is wide open. On the other hand, the Human Rights Council could also do it. And of course, they did create a similar accountability mechanism in relation to Myanmar, the IIM on Myanmar, with a very similar functionality and mandate. So clearly, the members of the Human Rights Council can take a good hard look at the consequences of their actions last year, reflect on, if ever there was a demonstration that such a mechanism is needed, it's been the kinds of atrocity crimes that we've heard described by my colleagues in recent months, and take action through the Human Rights Council to do that. As Human Rights Watch, and I think this is the case for a number of our NGO colleagues as well, we don't have strong feelings, frankly, about which venue this takes place. And the key thing is to get it done, and to get it done as a matter of urgency. As people have said, the lives of Yemeni civilians really are at stake, and we are seeing the devastating toll of that on a daily basis. We know, of course, that speaking of the current context in which we're operating, much attention this session has been dominated, of course, by the conflict in Ukraine, and rightly so. But as Adi has pointed out, it demonstrates that when there is the political will, states can come together and put accountability first. And in the absence of that, we can expect the civilian toll to continue to rise. It's worth noting as well, of course, that just last weekend at the national level, we saw Saudi Arabia embark on the largest number of mass executions that it has perpetrated in decades, killing more than 80 people, many on ill-defined charges. And that suggests as well that we are in a context where states who are outside of council scrutiny seem to feel that they can act with complete impunity. So this really is a time when the Human Rights Council cannot preside over a new era of impunity. This must be a warning cry to states both in Geneva and in New York to work together, get the job done, and put in place the kind of accountability mechanism that is so urgently needed. Thanks.
Thank you for that, John. And thank you to all of our panelists for making so clear today why we can't just let politics prevail and the millions of lives that are at stake if a new mechanism is not put in place. We will now hear some remarks from the floor. Our first speaker is Luc Duckendorff, Deputy Permanent Representative of Luxembourg to the UN in Geneva. Luc, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks very much, Jacqueline, and many thanks to all the speakers from civil society. It's always sobering, but also heartening to hear from you, because you're reminding us of what our responsibilities are, and that the UN wasn't founded to take mankind to heaven, but to save it from hell, in Dag Hammarskjöld's words, or rather in the words of the Charter, that it was established to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And we're not exactly doing very well in that level at the moment. As Radia said in her statement, there seems to be a competition between catastrophes going on. Afghanistan, where 95% of people are threatened by hunger, Myanmar, where a genocide is still going on and the illegal junta is holding on to power, South Sudan, where we've heard no later than this morning, 8.9 million people are at risk of starvation because predatory elites are playing games with their future. And then, of course, a war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine, that you will have heard very much about in recent days and weeks. None of that reduces in any way the responsibility of what all of you have called the international community to act in support of Yemen and its people. We all know the hashtag Yemen can't wait. It's been waiting for more than 7 years now, and still the war continues, and both sides of the conflict have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, very likely, and widespread human rights abuses, which have been documented fairly and impartially by the Group of Eminent Experts, and still the mandate of the Group of Eminent Experts wasn't renewed. That comes on top of a humanitarian catastrophe that gets worse and worse. And to testify of the ineffectiveness of us all as international community, no later than this week, there was a high-level pledging event for Yemen. And UN OCHA had asked for $4.3 billion to save the lives of millions of people in Yemen, and they received 1.3 billion in pledges. 3 billion are missing, and even 3/4 of that came from only two donors. That's absolutely unacceptable. I want to conclude that there isn't really what we've talked about, the international community. It doesn't exist in a monolith. It doesn't exist as such. There's 193 states in the General Assembly. There's 47 states in the Human Rights Council, and all of them are represented by people of flesh and blood, like you and I. And all of these people have to make sure that their priorities align with the Charter's principles and the idea that we believe in something that's called universal human rights and international law and international humanitarian law. These are universal principles. They apply everywhere and to everybody, and every state has an obligation to respect them. And they are put in place not only to prevent us, to protect us from war, but also to protect us from arbitrary power. And I think it's this realization of responsibility to protect people from the worst crimes known to humanity that should really encourage us all to do what's right. And again, that goes for all the states that I've mentioned, 193 in the General Assembly, but also the 47 in the Human Rights Council. And again, thanks very much to all civil society speakers for really pushing us to keep doing our job. Thank you.
Thank you, Luc. Now I'll turn the floor to Rama Hansera, Yemen Country Director at Save the Children.
Thank you for this opportunity. What I would like to add is very simple. Save the Children does believe in two things when it comes to this, namely the fairly uncontroversial position that warring parties have a moral and legal obligation to protect civilians in armed conflict, but also that when left to their own devices, warring parties could fail to meet those obligations. To put it simply, when warring parties feel that they can get away with violating international law, they will, and they have. Since the GEE's termination, the number of civilian casualties have doubled, and we saw that parties to conflict using fake videos to justify attacks on infrastructure that could cripple the country for years to come. And we also saw international governments pretending like none of this is happening on the ground in Yemen, failing to even mention any of these events in their public discourse. We understand also that compliance with international law could be costly. It could cost an international government a trade partner, or cost a party to conflict not to win a particular battle, or another the chance to draw on the endless number of child soldiers used as fodder in the ongoing conflict. But this is the only thing that maintains our humanity, when what separates us from a world where anything goes and laws must be respected. This is what we are sadly seeing in Yemen today, and this is why it is imperative that an international accountability mechanism is reinstated. We hope that the mechanism records no violations of international law, but we also know that unless somebody is watching, actors will prioritize winning over compliance with their obligations. We know this because what we have seen in the last 7 years, and particularly because of what we have seen in the last 6 months in the rise in civilian casualties and seemingly wanton destruction of infrastructure and disregard for the impact on civilians. We need this until the distraught father in Thais, who asked us, if I send my children to school, will I see them again? Does not have to weigh the importance of their children's education with their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Rama. We've reached the end of our time today. On behalf of the Global Center and all our co-sponsors, we'd like to thank the incredible panelists for sharing their invaluable expertise in calling for an accountability mechanism. And we'd also like to thank our virtual audience for your participation in today's event. Thank you.